Sign Mode of Magic, and it's with great pleasure for me to welcome my guest, Wahid Azal. Wahid is a sheikh. He is also too a Sufi, and as well a Grand Sufi of the Fatimiya Sufi Order. And I'm going to go ahead and welcome him. Hello, Wahid. How are you?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful. Greetings.
Thank you. You know, I actually have a pre-interview on my site, monomagic.com, for people who are viewing our interview, because there's a lot of information to be covered. There's a lot of in-depth information that you've provided for me that I've given you some pre-questions. So if you do have any concerns or anything that you would like to refer back to, at the end of this particular video, and as well as on my site, you'll see under the media section, you'll see an area there where I have interviewed Wahid Azal, and he's graciously giving me very in-depth information of all the questions, or let's just say a summary of the questions that we'll be asking or discussing today. Well, Wahid, could you go ahead and really go into being a Sufi and how that really differentiates from, or how it actually plays into Islam?
Well, Sufism, or Tasawwuf, as it's known in Arabic, is the inner or mystical path of Islam. The nomenclature, however, in some ways can be misleading, because Sufism didn't really arise as a separate movement, because the central figures and central teachings of Sufism are the Quran, the figure of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family, peace be upon them. And all of these, the piety around Islam formulated a very distinct way of a path within Islam from very early on that distinguished it from a more what you would call the esotericist, or the outward focused kind of piety. Sufis pray like all Muslims. Sufis observe all aspects of the Sharia. Sufis fast. Sufis are basically indistinguishable in their own environment from the rest of the Muslim Ummah, as it were. What distinguishes Sufis today, or at least historically, from the rest of the Muslim community is a set of practices that have been refined over time. For example, the repetitive dhikr, or one of the names of God that is continually repeated over and over and over again as a mantra, which is exactly the same thing as mantra in some of the Eastern traditions. You do find certain pious or pietistic Muslims who are not Sufis also practicing this, because there's a whole litany of sacred words and prayers that have been passed down, whether from hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, the Imams, peace be upon them. But what distinguishes Sufis is that these practices are utilized for experiencing the living God, as it were. Okay. Whereas, now just remember that these things are very fluid. In its own environment, sometimes you often come across people who are not Sufis or not initiated, but they practice certain things that are Sufi-esque. Okay. With the Sufis, and especially from around the 12th, 13th centuries, when you had the crystallization of the Sufi orders, there was a transmission over time of these various practices that were refined, that contain both a very deep theosophical angle. There's a very rich metaphysical transmission around the actual practice itself that is passed from sheikh or master to master to master, as well as certain practices other than those that are unique to each of these various orders that were also passed on from sheikh to sheikh to sheikh until the present time. What we are, in essence, I was initially, first of all, I was initiated into another order back in the early 90s when I was still living in the United States. My teacher subsequently passed on. And before he passed on, he didn't really designate any successors as such. What he did with me specifically was urge me to investigate and look deeper into my own family heritage. And my family heritage included a woman in the 19th century by the name of Tahira Qurratul Ayn, the pure solace of the eyes, who was one of the leading members of a movement called the Babis. And she was recognized at her time as being the return of Fatima Zahra, peace be upon her, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who then we claim as the central figure of our order. And this also stems from an initiatic experience I had virtually the very same night that I was physically in this world, initiated by my teacher at the time, where I actually dreamt of Fatima in the astral worlds. And I was taken in the dream to Mecca on a full moon night, and there was no one there in the Haram, in the Great Mosque, other than myself and the Kaaba. And the door of the Kaaba opened, and a female voice, bade me to come in, and I went in. And when I went in, there was a woman seated inside the Kaaba itself, draped all in green with a white niqab that had the Arabic word al-Hayy, the living. And she told me to sit right in front of her, and I did. And then next to her was the double-edged sword of Ali, known as Zulfiqar, the famous two-forked sword of Ali. And she told me to open my mouth, and I opened my mouth, and she took the sword and then pierced my tongue with the sword of Ali, Zulfiqar. Then the next scene of the dream, I remember I was transported into this ecstatic golden world, where it was like an infinite desert, but all the flakes, all the sand in this infinite desert were made of flakes of gold. And as I was standing there in this scene, the sun rises, and as the sun rises, there's the unveiled face of Fatima, and then this face and sun that is rising transforms into this tree. And then I wake up with the actual physical sun shining through my bedroom window in my face. And I told my sheikh this, and he smiled at the time, and he said, then one day you will need to do something with this. And that's how the Fatimiya Sufi Order came about initially, and about a little over about 12, 13 years later, when I had been working with ayahuasca for a couple of years already, the Amazonian psychoactive tea sacred to the Amerindian peoples, I had a vision again at the same Fatima, and she gave me these words in Arabic to recite 13 times. La ilaha illallah, Fatima wajhullah. There is no God but God, and Fatima is the face of God. And she made me recite this 13 times inside the ayahuasca experience. And in this experience as such is when the Fatimiya Sufi Order was born. I continued to work with the ayahuasca in its Amerindian, Amazonian form for about 3 years after this experience. And then again, in early 2008, there was another vision of Fatima, and she bade me at this point to begin working with the Isfan, which is the Syrian root, Kalam Harmala, which is the herb of my own ancestors, the Iranian people, and very sacred herb in Iran, even to Shia Muslims.
Wow. That is a lot to come from, and also too, you've mentioned the lineage that you've got, and you've mentioned, the vision and the interaction that you've had. Now, with all of this, and I believe that I had discussed this with you offline, there's been a long time in between the beginning of Islam and also to, coming into Sufism. Why now? Why the order now? Why the order in 2005? Hasn't there been someone else you would suspect that would have had a vision or that she would have come to?
This is a very important, very pertinent question, and the answer is that throughout time, certain practices or tendencies or orders or lineages, this is the function of time. They begin to lose something over time, right? It doesn't mean that the essence itself is gone. It's just that the essence itself may be or maybe not as vibrant as it was. So just like a root or a tree may, root it somewhere in one specific place, and then, branch itself off into a completely different place over time, the same thing happened to us. I never, growing up in the States or in Australia, I never thought that this would actually come about. But, the powers that be make their own choices.
Yes.
And because of the bloodline issue with Tahir Quratul Ain, that is another significant issue involved in this. And also because the Babis, which is the lineage or the faith or the creed that we're also trying to revive within the Fatimiya Sufi Order, has been at a danger for quite a long time of disappearing completely. There are very few Azali Babis or Bayanis in the world. It's been, maybe luckily about 3,000 or 4,000 people in total. And this body of teachings, specific body of teachings, deserve to live.
Yes.
And so they choose their own. We have a saying. All the Sufis in Iran have a saying that the greatest name, which is the most important symbol in our tradition, chooses its own. It chooses people over time who work with it to do certain tasks for it. So what the Fatimiya Sufi Order represents, in essence, is us working to keep a certain sacred body of teachings alive in the modern world. That was at one point, on the verge of disappearing altogether.
Yes. Well, can you give me the information, or is it too personal and private to let me know approximately how many are in the order?
We have I don't disclose the number of people that are in order. There are a few people. We're a few right now, and I would actually like to keep it small as an esoteric one. I don't really wish to grow too much because then it forces you to compromise on certain things. But we are a substantial number of people who are engaged. There is a representation in Australia. There is one person who is representing the order there, who has a formal function known as the keeper of the tea. And we have, usually when there are sessions happening with the tea, sometimes between 10, 20 people show up, sometimes less, sometimes more, but the core group of about 5 or 6 people is always a constant.
I see. Now, let's move over to the mysticism, the esoteric aspect of a Sufi, and the correlation as to how Islam actually reacts to it. I realize that you've given me a very elaborate explanation as to the difference, but I would like to make it clear to everyone how it's understood and accepted within Islam, because that has a lot to play on how much why in fact being a Sufi is so mysterious to so many Westerners.
Well, I mean, the status of Sufism, especially now in the modern period, is extremely controversial in both major sects of Islam, whether Sunni or Shia. But this is more amongst the establishment and the more orthodox practitioners of the faith. And in the modern period, it's especially controversial given the fact that there's been a movement, especially over the last 100 years, of what its claimants are saying is an attempt to purify Islam of any foreign accretions that have come to it over time. I'm particularly thinking of the Wahhabis and the Salafiyya movement, out of which most of these takfiris and jihadists come from these days in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, obviously. But as some of my traditionalist friends have argued very convincingly in the past, Sufism in many ways is a normative and traditional form of Islamic praxis that has been from the very, even before the orders came together as such. It's controversial today because Islam has been ideologized. It's become politicized. And it is no longer the intent of these establishments to really practice a spirituality. It is about politics with that. But unfortunately, this all came about because of colonialism and the legacy of European and Western imperialism in the region. This tendency is right now is what I call a smoldering fire that basically needs to put itself out at some point. But with that said, in Iran and in the Shia world in general, although the establishment might sometimes have a problem with Sufis, there's been more of an acceptance of Sufism. than other parts of the Muslim world. And the reason for this is simple. It's because all of the Sufi orders, with probably one notable exception, the Naqshbandis, all trace their lineage back to the Ahl Bayt, the family of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Everybody considers Ali, upon him be peace, to be the central figure of the tradition. It is he who transmitted these teachings, these secret teachings, that the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him, transmitted to Ali. So the status of Sufism is in some ways more protected, although, politics and power trips by various regimes often, there are always problems, between governments and these Sufi orders, especially if these Sufi orders become too political. But in Iran, it's generally better accepted and better dealt with, and always has been.
I see. Now, to go into Sufism, is it something that needs to have a bloodline within individuals?
Not necessarily, no. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bloodline. Most of the mashayikh, the masters, the contemporary masters, say in Iran or Pakistan, have some kind of a bloodline happening. You often see most of the masters being sayyids in some way or another related to the family of the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, but we have also had masters who have not been from any bloodline. So it really depends on the order. On an occult or esoteric level, well, the blood is a very important thing.
Yes.
The blood is not just the transmitter of a physical energy; it's also a transmitter of a spiritual energy. And so within this tradition, the reason why you have the importance of these bloodlines going on is because of that understanding.
Of course. And because there is a female center point that we're talking about here, can you give a little bit of elaboration on the acceptance of the female presence? Because most people assume that Islam is anti-female, let's just say, oriented in the position of authority or respect in a way. It's I don't want to put it that way, but that's how many people revere Islam, and I know to be false, but I'd like to hear it from you.
Well, the position of women in our order is that they are equals. In that respect, we are like the Alavis of Turkey, who also allow women in their order to act in equal functions with the men. In fact, I envision my successor in this Fatimiyya to be a woman, and I would like to, pass on this tradition in that form, because I think it's a very important example for the Ummah that this happened, that women within an esoteric and a spiritual context be given more authority and representation. So in that respect, we are different. The thing people have to understand about the status of women in the Islamic world is that exoteric institutions have interpreted certain issues in certain ways. If you dig deep enough into the history, especially into the sayings of the prophets and the imams, peace be upon them, you find that many of the contemporary practices have actually no roots at all, textually, in the early lifetime of Islam as a religion. A prominent example of this is the hijab, right? For example, the niqab, this complete covering of the female that you find in a lot of Sunni fundamentalist countries, has absolutely no textual basis whatsoever. Most of this practice is cultural, that it came from certain areas that were covering women in the way they were, and also it stems from the interaction in the early period of the Muslim community with the Byzantine Christians and Zoroastrians who were covering women. So the root of the hijab in Islam actually is not a originary Islamic practice, at least in that full covering mode. What you have in the Quran, there was an incident in Medina where these Arab men were entering the Prophet's house, peace be upon him, without announcing themselves. The Prophet was with his family, that's why these people just barge in. And the verse comes down that tell the wives of the Prophets to exercise modesty, so that they are the wives of the Prophet are distinct from the rest of the community, and people aren't just barging into the patriarch's home at a whim. And what we understand when we piece all of this together, and as scholars like Fatima Bernisi wrote in her very influential book, The Veil and the Male Elite, the early practice of the Muslim community in Medina and the immediate era was just, people, the women would very modestly cover themselves, cover their hair was everywhere. It wasn't like this. This is all things that have accreted over time, over the last 1400 years, and it's basically about, institutions of patriarchy and power. This is, and politics. This is what it is about. Now, that doesn't mean that all the Sufis subscribe to this. There's a lot of debate, and I'm sure a lot of my fellow Muslim brothers, Sufi and Shia alike, will have a problem with me saying this stuff. But even in a lot of Sufi orders, you still find this segregation, in a very marked kind of way. Men's section, women's section, right? But in, for example, orders like the Bektashis, which is a Shia Sufi order, or the Alavis of Turkey, the Shiites of Turkey, there is no segregation. Within these Shia Sufi orders of Turkey, there is an acceptance of the equality of man and woman. Okay? And this was also a teaching of the Bab, the Bayanis, that men and women are equal. And in the function of a sacerdotal function, men and women are equal. Women are equal before God. So this is in a sense, the Spirit judges by people's intentions and actions, not by their gender.
Indeed.
Nevertheless, the gender, femininity as such and masculinity as such, also have to be simultaneously respected for their own ontology, as it were. We're not trying to level out the playing field in the sense that we want to dissolve gender. Gender exists. Right. Gender has a metaphysical root, but it has to be accepted in segregation in that way as the end.
That was beautifully said. Thank you for that. That's actually very great. I haven't heard anyone say it so eloquently and so so profound. With that, you mentioned something that rings a bell to me to really talk to you about and bring up, and that is sacrament, and that is the going through the gnosis of what you do receive. Through the various rituals that your order actually has taken place to do, and I would love for you to really elaborate on that, because sure. As you know, many people do use external substances and herbs to take them into a state of being, to receive whatever type of gnosis, whatever type of induce a certain, let's say, relationship. And I'd love for you to explain how you go about that.
First of all, let me say that the gnosis is obtainable to multiple ways. We have a hadith from the Prophet, peace be upon him, who says that there are as many paths to God as there are people. So there is no such thing as one way. It's basically your relation with the spirit. However, the plant world, the interaction of the plant world with the human being has been a very important part of the spiritual growth of human beings. Look at the imageries that we have throughout all the world's major religions. The tree is always present. There's always plants depicted. These entheogenic plants, in my opinion, and in the opinion of someone like Terence McKenna, play a very important part, not just in the spiritual evolution, but even the physical evolution of human beings. This theory that McKenna threw out back in the 80s, and I think there's a lot of merit to what he's saying. That doesn't mean that there isn't a way to reach God without these, but with these entheogenic plants, for example, the mushroom or the Hoama or the ayahuasca, there's a faster way to have experience of the spirit. It doesn't mean it is a shortcut to enlightenment. There's no shortcut to enlightenment. You still have to put in the hard yards. But it is one way to allow people to open themselves up to the spirit world in a very fast sort of way, and oftentimes even a very confrontational sort of way, because it's very fast. Instead of sitting and fasting for 20 days, over the course of a couple hours, boom, you're there. With us, this is a sacrament, and we respect the plant, and we see the plant as a theurgy of a spirit. So we treat the plant as if we don't worship the plant as such, but we treat the plant because it is the receptor that allows us closer communication with the spirit world. We don't recommend that people who are non-initiates, throw themselves into this. Working with psychoactive plants has its dark side. People who are not prepared adequately for these sorts of experiences should not have them. People who don't understand the concept of spiritual hygiene should not interact with these plants. People who don't have some kind of a practice, whatever practice this may be, in my humble opinion, should not be engaging with these plants. Unfortunately, there's also a culture of tripping, and people, look at these things not so much as sacraments, but as party drugs. And unfortunately, sometimes also suffer the consequences with these things. But in an occult and a magical setting, in my opinion, when we look at these, especially these shamanic cultures that have existed alongside of us and everywhere virtually, all of these cultures have always interacted with these plants. The plants, whatever plant has been sacred and sacramental to these cultures, has been their way of interacting with the spirit world. And one can say that even in the Islamic world, there are hints of this. There's a scholar by the name of Christian Rich who's written some studies. He hasn't actually said anything explicitly about the birth of Islam, but he has hinted several times now in several things that he's written that there would maybe even be an angle to the birth of Islam with certain, psilocybin mushrooms that are growing in the caves of Arabia, especially in the cave of Hira. This does in no way, shape, or form whittle down on the claim of the Prophet of Islam and the peace be upon him, or the legitimacy of Islam. It just says that this plant is available, and this, made the connection between him and Archangel Gabriel. So that's basically it, in kind of a summary nutshell.
I see. Well, I can understand that because that is part of nature, and it's not to alienate or not accept what has been given to us and for us to use. I mean, it was put here for some reason. Going deeper into the topic, then, I see a lot of similarities within the actual Western Hermeticism and occultism that I see in the works of what lots of Sufis do. Or is it the other way around?
This is a chicken and an egg kind of question, but yeah. The roots of the Western Hermetic tradition are with the Islamic occult tradition. And there are more and more scholars that are actually coming to this conclusion with a lot of evidence, too. Now, which Western Hermetic tradition are we talking about? Are we talking about the Hermetic tradition of late antiquity, or are we talking about, the Western Hermetic tradition that emerges from the Renaissance onwards? Because there's also a huge gap period where these, teachings and practices weren't present in Europe. But the major transmitter of a lot of these teachings that then later get formed from the period of the Renaissance onwards is with a lot of these texts and figures of the Islamic world. A prominent figure, for example, like Geber, Jaber ibn Hayya, who's the major alchemist of the Islamic world, and he was actually a disciple of the sixth Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, upon him be peace. Then there is the figure of Al-Buni, although Al-Buni wasn't so much known in the Western world, but his works kind of trickled into various parts of Southern Europe. There's evidence of that. The whole configuration of the magic squares that end up using with names of God from around, I would say, the late medieval period. These are coming straight out of texts about Buni, because we don't have much evidence of this in Europe before that period. Unless you want to, even if you look at some of the Kabbalists of about the 12th, 13th century, the Jews, they were actively interacting with Muslim Sufis all the time, through southern Spain, through routes through North Africa and Palestine, etc., etc., etc. So, in that sense, whereas the late Hellenistic period transmitted this whole body of teaching to the Islamic world, then itself went into a kind of several centuries of a dark age lockdown. Once, the European civilization started, slowly coming out of that, Then you see a trickling of these teachings back until the modern period. These teachings then and practices take on their own formation in the Western Hermetic tradition.
I see. Well, does that go ever into the darker areas of the esoteric world, or is it always, let's say, per se, in the light?
Okay. In the Islamic occult tradition, or actually within the Islamic culture as a whole, there is a exoteric prescription against what is called sihr. And sihr is black magic. And this issue is even addressed in the Quran. In fact, the last two surahs of the Quran were revealed to the Prophet, peace be upon him, as a antidote against black magic, especially the final surah of the Quran. Now, black magic, of the kind that was practiced in the Arabia of the 6th, 7th century, were various forms of witchcraft, like blowing on knots and burying these knots inside the wells, and bewitchment. Nevertheless, when you have a text such as the Quran that then prescribes antidotes, then it means that there is also within this text a practice of white magic. Having said that, as the tradition grew and expanded and became more sophisticated, there was definitely these two true trends. So you do have a theurgical tradition on the one hand, and then you have a goetic tradition on the other hand as well simultaneously. And sometimes in a few texts these two even go hand in hand. You have a section of the book talking about various things to do with white magic, and then on the other hand it shows you how to conjure up demons and jinns and afarit and a whole hierarchy of various dark beings and that sort of thing to do various jobs. I personally don't recommend people get into that because you can never protect yourself too much from certain entities on certain levels. And unless you have total control of your mind and total control of your environment and total control that these things don't then seep out into the lives of other people, then you really are playing with fire. But yeah, the tradition exists. You do have a Goetic tradition within the Islamic occult tradition, for sure. Lots of texts on it.
I see. There's been a trend that I have seen personally of many people shrink wrapping various traditions, and as well as going and learning from some adept. And then having their own little order and saying, okay, fine, now I'm the guru. Any possibility of that happening within Sufism? Because I kind of think that probably not, but I'm quite sure I'm wrong.
No, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's Sufism, unfortunately, has not been immune to these things. We're living in an age where besides the occult forces around us, there's also these other forces of quantification, where people, especially when a given lineage or a given order loses something, then people hang on to things, right? I am quite happy to walk away from all of this. I'm even right now, just to walk away. It's almost like, in a sense, I say this to my wife sometimes and she laughs. Every time you think you're out, they pull you back in. It's like being in a celestial mafia, as it were.
Yeah.
But yeah, these things happen, and we have so many examples of this everywhere. And I have horror stories from people who have been pulled into various cults and whatnot, and have been completely abused. Their money has been taken away from them. They have been messed with psychologically and really, really damaged spiritually. And my heart goes to each and every one of these people, because this is not what the spiritual path is about at all. This is not what it's about. There is a vibrant multiverse out there that is even begging humans to interact with it, And when someone abuses, when a given teacher, either self-appointed or even, not self-appointed, abuses that baby, as it were, that has been put as a trust into their hands to develop, then that is the greatest sin of all. If there really is the greatest sin of all, is people who do that sort of thing.
I would definitely agree. I would definitely agree. But with that, what if someone wanted to go into Sufism? What if someone even wanted to join the Fatimiya Order? I mean, is that possible, or how does it all
Sure,
work out about education?
it is possible. There are a range of Sufi orders in the Islamic world that people can choose from. Turkey is a very good place for people who want to go to that environment. They should be very discerning about who they decide to make bayat with, the giving the initiatic pact to. Um, People are welcome to come to the Fatimiya. However, I insist that at very minimum that certain requirements or internal rules of the order that we have be abided by, and that people make a fundamental commitment to themselves to see the process through to the end. You know, but my position is that people should be also allowed autonomy to realize the practices. So there are periods of time that we won't see each other. Okay, so that there is a deepening process of the practice, because in my opinion the practice is everything. It is everything. It is your tool. It is your way in. It is your way to realization, and without a practice you're just wasting your time. I am not interested in cultivating cults of personality. This is one of the reasons I decided to take our website down, because I thought if this thing ever started to grow, then that danger would have been there. And right now, the only thing available is my blog and my Facebook page. People are free to interact with me however they want. If they are serious, however, in coming into the Fatimiya, I insist that people contact me face to face and interact with me and let me see where they're at, assess their own situation, learn a little bit about their history, etc. Before I would allow them, a full initiation into the Fatimiya Sufi Order. And I think it's not just fair to the order; it's also fair to that person that one is that way with them.
I really agree with that, and I really, I that's why I'm honored to have you here, because of your ethics and, quote unquote, your old school way, or let's just say the proper traditional way, going through initiation. And too often you can do initiation at a distance, and it's pretty much an email here and there, or even a phone call, or even something in the mail of fill out this application, and you never know how your mentor lives, or how the life of that person, how the spirituality has in fact affected that person and those people. So that's quite important that many people should take a look at.
The thing is, the whole concept of a virtual initiation is comedy to me. What does that even mean? If, whether you do it over a telephone or over the internet, these energies you have to be face to face with. It has to be right in front of you. You have to feel it. You have to experience it. If it's on a virtual, it's artificial. It's not real. But unfortunately, this is the sign of the times. This is our culture is turning everything virtual. Everything. Even the experience of the spirit is becoming virtual. In our world these days.
Yes, I would have to say, and in lieu of several conversations that I've had before with other people, and even arguments online, that the reason why many people are, let's say, on the fence about virtual initiation is because the spirit world is of that world, something you cannot hold. But in fact, in essence, you actually can hold it. You actually can feel it. And it's about the actual interaction of that, because we are a flesh. But I do feel that it is necessary, though. So I guess I'll solve my own case. But because we are a flesh, we do have certain laws within this world, this realm, that we have to abide by. So I would be against virtual initiation. However, for those who are into it, I guess that's as far as I'll get virtually.
Let me just bracket that. When you put your finger on something very important there, okay? What we can look at it as a good virtual and a bad virtual, okay? In my humble opinion, a electronic format is the bad virtual. It's not real. But the dream states, for example, these are virtual states, and initiations happen all the time. In ayahuasca states or in entheogenic state, these initiations can come when you open your eyes. And when you're in the world of matter, these experiences can be virtual, but they are real nevertheless. So let's just be very clear when we're talking about what virtuality involves. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yes, sure.
Absolutely right.
Well, the order has been in operation for quite some time now, and it's growing. And of course, you want to expand in every way possible. Is there anything that you would like to add to what you would like to contribute to saying about the Fatima order, or anything that you would like to ask other people to understand that they possibly may have misunderstood from the correspondences that you've had over the years?
Well, I mean, on the expansion level, like I said before, I would rather that our order remained small, but it remained a committed cadre and core of people. What I would probably add is, we are also, we didn't get into this, is that I also insist that people stand for something in the world. It's not enough for one to have one's head in the clouds. You have to, whatever you get from the spirit world, in my opinion, it should be also channeled into the world. So I encourage people who are with me to get politically active, because this is one of the ways that one can affect, whether one does it or not is irrelevant, but to stand for it and to fight the good fight is a very important charge that I put on people, because I do it also myself, And currently, for example, as I mentioned in the written part of the interview, we're getting very involved in the Australian side of things with the Australian Aboriginal sovereignty movement and fighting and advocating for these First Nations and Indigenous people in Australia. This is a cause very dear and near to me, and with all the people over there that are also affiliated with me, and we're really trying to push this issue with people over there.
I see. Well, it's been fabulous having you on, and
likewise, thank you.
You have actually laid out so much and in such a great way that I have to say that I've been impressed by even the things that you have said, and I feel it I feel very synchronized to and very much in agreement to much of what you've said. In fact, I don't disagree to anything. But I would like to thank you again for the time and the information, and you sharing a wealth of knowledge.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
eşyaya beni bakma isyan